Many of the folks on the U.S. left, they've tended to look benignly at 1776. In fact, my book that has been criticized most sharply is precisely the counter-revolution of 1776. Although every cloud has a silver lining, that's the book that's probably sold best because many people want to find out what the controversy is about. Hollywood focuses on organized crime because Hollywood is infested by organized crime. Just as in the music industry, you've had this phenomenon known as gangster rap, which has led to this allied phenomena. In ordinary lingo in the United States, gangsta has become a verb, an adjective. It does a lot of work. Shirley Graham Du Bois stays on in Ghana, becomes the director of television in Ghana. What she tries to do is install television monitors in villages in Africa, in classrooms, so that television could become a tool for mass education, as opposed to what it has become in the United States, at least, and perhaps elsewhere. That is to say, a tool for misinformation, a tool for mindless entertainment, where it is referred to colloquially as the boob tube. Now, perhaps some of you are wondering, okay, Professor Horne, we hear what you're saying, but here you are, you're sitting in Texas telling us all this. Why are you allowed to do this? Well, that's a good question. And I'm not sure if I will be allowed to do this for much longer. But fortunately, I'm able to do so now. And so I will do so until the last breath escapes from my body.
So hi everyone, and welcome to this fifth episode of Amandla, the multi-Panafrican international program on Black Power Media Reloaded, with historian and political activist and also the favorite guest on Black Power Media, Dr. Gerald Horne. So our guest is a historian, longtime political activist in anti-racist, Pan-African and working class struggles. He holds the Moose Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is the author of at least 50 books on a wide range of critically important issues for the oppressed masses around the globe, including class struggles, Black internationalism, the music and film industry, imperialism, the resistance of enslaved Africans, settler colonialism, and anti-colonial resistance. His latest books include, and I'm going to show them on the screen. All right, so the first one is this one, African Americans and the New History of the USA, right? And the latest book that was published only a few weeks ago, which is already available for pre-order, is titled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1865. Sorry about that. Okay. So our guest was trained as a lawyer and has been at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle in the US in the 1980s as the president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. He's also the co-producer and host of Freedom Now, a weekly Pan-African internationalist and anti-imperialist program which airs on KPFK 19.7 FM on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific, and can be found at kpfk.org and on the YouTube channel of the Activist News Network. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest of three other important programs that are worth mentioning. The Horne Report on Diasporic Music, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time and replays on the Activist News Network. And finally, Around the Horne, a weekly international news update on the Activist News Network. and I almost forgot, De Facto podcast with our comrade and friend Anthony Ballas. So, Dr. Horne, as always, welcome on Black Power Media, and welcome to this fifth episode of Amandla.
Thank you for inviting me.
So for those who are joining us for the first time, I would just like to remind you that this is the fifth episode of Amandla, in which in each episode we're trying to cover books that some of the 50 books that Dr. Horne has been writing since the 1980s. So just as a reminder, the books that were covered in the previous episodes that people can find on the YouTube channel of Black Power Media include this one, I Dare Say, Gerald Horne. This was the first book that we covered. Then we also discussed this book, The Deeper South, the United States, Brazil, and the African Slave Trade, The End of Empires, African Americans in India, and also Black and Brown African Americans in the Mexican Revolution, 1910-1920. So for this first session of Amandla, we're not going to cover one, but two books, which are related and also complementary. So the first one is that Dr. Horne wrote about 20 years ago, it was probably 2005, Race War, White Supremacy, and the Japanese Attack on the British Empire. And the second one, more recent, published in 2018, is titled Facing the Rising Sun, African Americans, Japan, and the Rise of Afro-Asian Solidarity. Okay, so Dr. Horne, I wanted to start with the first book that I mentioned, Race War, right? So this book, okay, that was published almost 20 years ago. So you start the book on the first few pages with a statement that which I found quite intriguing, and I wanted to ask you if you could tell us more about that statement, the context, and I'm also going to share it on the screen here. All right. Right. So it says, right, I think we can see it on the screen now. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I'm quoting you, Dr. Horne. You say in the first few pages of that book, I should make clear early on that if I had been living during the era of the Pacific War, I would have fought against Japan, though I would have been subjected to discriminatory, racially segregated treatment in the US military. Thus, readers should be alert to the fact that my indictment of London and Washington is not intended as an exculpation of Tokyo. Instead, I am seeking to show how London's racial policies in particular actually enabled Tokyo. Likewise, I recognize above all that there were salient factors beyond race that shaped the Pacific War, economics, geopolitics, and anti-fascism in the first place. In other words, this book is not the latest chapter in the ongoing saga that has become so popular in North America, to an extent in the North Atlantic generally, that is, the Good War, quote, fought by the greatest generation, unquote. So, Dr. Horne, as a first question, I wanted to ask you, why did you feel that you had to make this clarification? Was it because you were already anticipating the critics of those who would have claimed that you are race reductionist, or to use a favorite term of Ellen Muscolini and the MAGA fans, were you anticipating the critics that would have, accused you of being woke?
Well, you know how it is when you write a book. Oftentimes you give talks as a premonition of what you're going to publish. And in giving talks in the run-up and the prelude to this book, Race War, I had been peppered with criticisms to the effect that I was soft on Japan, that I was overlooking the highly relevant fact that in the run-up to World War II, there's little doubt that Japan was trying to convert China in a manner equivalent to how the United States and Europe had treated Africa. That is to say, as a source of cheap labor, as a source of free labor, as a source for natural resources, etc. And so I was being accused of being insensitive to the just struggles of the Chinese people. But I think that what I was trying to do in those sentences and what I was trying to do in the book overall is to complicate our understanding of the past. Because I think with regard to the subject of this book, already we're enmeshed today in 2025 in another chapter of a long-running saga involving, among other factors, Europe versus Asia. Now, of course, the worm has turned, and as represented in a statement given in the last 24 hours by U.S. Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth, the United States is trying to ratchet up tensions with the People's Republic of China, interestingly enough. And what I was trying to do in this book, among other things, is to point out how we got to this perilous point. Perhaps I should begin by talking about how in the 16th century, as Europe was expanding globally into the Philippines, into Africa, into the Americas, Tokyo, Japan, actually shut the door and engaged in 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation in order to prevent this scourge from entering their shores. In fact, you may be familiar with a film by the famed, celebrated US director Martin Scorsese, which deals with Christian missionaries seeking to penetrate Japan, and they received a very rude reception, shall we say. And the point of view of the filmmaker is that we should be sympathizing with the Christian missionaries as they seek to open the door to Japan, because we all know, all you have to do is look at the history of Hawaii to see that the Christian missionaries are oftentimes an advance guard for the colonizers and the imperialists. As they say in Hawaii, when the missionaries arrived, the missionaries had the Bible and the indigenous had the land. And within a few decades, the descendants of the missionaries had the land and the indigenous had the Bible. But in any case, to cut to the chase, by the 1850s, with the United States spreading from the Atlantic to the Pacific, with Japan seizing Hong Kong circa 1841, 1842, the jig was up for Japan. And you might know that the US authorities had landed on Japanese shores and had demanded that this nation and this economy be, quote, opened up. And in an episode that I dare say our friends in Africa need to study very closely and intently, within about a decade and a half, Japan had turned itself around. That is to say, it had purged the feudalists, for example. Once again, a footnote with regard to Hollywood. This is dealt with in a Tom Cruise vehicle, The Last Samurai, which deals, among other things, with the retreat of feudalism in Japan. But what's interesting is that Hollywood sympathizes with the feudalists. You would think that they would sympathize with the rising capitalists. But of course, they don't sympathize with their class comrades, because their class comrades in Japan already were presenting a stiff challenge to the capitalists and imperialists across the Pacific in the United States. I mean, look at Hollywood, for example. Look at the incursions that Sony has made into the U.S. film industry. So in any case, this rise of Japanese capitalism and imperialism is greeted very badly in the United States and in Britain in particular. Part of the struggle is played out in Hawaii. That's the subject of my book, The White Pacific. I'm publishing a book next year entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in Asia and Pacific. The Hawaii Coup, of course, takes place in 1893. And you should also know that this event does not escape the attention of others, particularly Black Americans. As I say in that book, and as I repeat in the book Facing the Rising Sun, there were many contradictions between and amongst W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, and the various ideological trends they represent. But to a greater or lesser degree, they all were sympathetic with Japan because they saw the rise of Japan as administering sledgehammer blows against white supremacy. The same could be said for Nehru of India, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, along with Du Bois, who saluted Japan's defeat of Russia in 1904 in a profoundly paradigmatic shift in the global correlation of racial forces. And this is the prelude and the run-up to the 1930s when Japan begins to advance in China, as Afro mentioned. That's when you begin to see the adoption of this term that's still resonant in Black America, the Asiatic Black man. Although when people use that term in 2025, I'm not sure if they are recognizing the roots and the antecedents of that term. That is to say, it was a recognition of this then reality that many Black Americans, they were not necessarily identifying with Africa because Africa was colonized, and that did not seem to present a model to emulate. That's why they called themselves Asiatic, because they were identifying with Japan. And as noted, this led many of them to take a soft line against Japanese depredations in China. That, of course, leads us into World War II and the Japanese takeover of Hong Kong from Britain, which is really the essence of the book Race War, and some very interesting turnabouts that I talk about in this book when the Europeans find themselves on the back foot, to put it mildly, with Japanese imperialists in the driver's seat. This culminates in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945, perhaps the most egregious episode in mass murder in the history of the world, which is saying something, when the United States drops atomic weapons on these two Japanese cities, killing mostly civilians, by the way, and the repercussions of that horrendous act have yet to be eliminated in terms of health problems, environmental problems, etc. Of course, since that time, Japan has been a reliable ally, more or less, of U.S. imperialism, although even that's beginning to change in 2025. You see this with regard to Mr. Trump's tariff war, which is really pulverizing the Japanese economy. You might have noticed that Nissan, the auto manufacturer, is engaging in layoffs. There's this very interesting controversy involving Nippon Steel, which is a major Japanese producer of steel, which wants to take over U.S. steel. There are those who say that if Nippon Steel was Anglo Steel based in the UK, there wouldn't be a controversy. But both Democratic and Republican administrations have invoked the question of national security in terms of an allied corporation, Nippon Steel, taking over U.S. Steel. Now, of course, Mr. Trump is trying to adjust, shall we say, that particular policy. But in any case, that's a long-winded summary and exposition of many of the issues presented in these two books.
Thanks for that, Dr. Horne. Before delving into the Japanese attack on Hong Kong and the British Empire in general, I wanted to talk about the racial, quote, landscape, unquote, in the colonies, in Hong Kong, and also in the British colonies prior to the Japanese attack. So in Race War, you're right, and I'm going to show the quote on the screen once again. Yeah. All right, I think you can see it now. Okay, so British China might have been a suburb of hell for many Chinese, but for the European refugees from the English-speaking world who flocked there, it was akin to paradise regained. There was a clearly defined social stratum in which one's place was fixed according to race and nationality, but also on the basis of position, accent, and education. Perhaps the penultimate symbol of the moneyed and the sumptuous life led by most Europeans in the colony before the war was the fact that simple soldiers could employ a barber on a monthly basis for about £1. Like Negro men in the Deep South, Chinese males of all ages were routinely referred to as boys and beaten for the slightest transgression. So, Dr. Horne, my question is this racial landscape that you describe in the book, so the racial landscape in Hong Kong, because the book is you're focusing, at least in the first chapters, on Hong Kong, is this an example of class collaboration among European settlers that you have analyzed and described in subsequent books? So as a reminder, the book was published in 2005, and in other books, the Counter-Revolution of 1776 and others, you conceptualize class collaboration. So that's why I'm asking if in this book that you've written in 2005, you are describing class collaboration, which is a term that you have not used back then.
Assuredly. And the euphemism I have deployed, I would deploy here. That is to say, class collaboration is the highest stage of white supremacy, and white supremacy is the highest stage of class collaboration. I think that when you take the lens away from North America and the Caribbean, for example, and place it on Hong Kong, you begin to see commonalities, not least class collaboration. And you begin to see why this system, this class collaboration, which not only undergirded settler colonialism, but undergirded colonialism, as for example in Hong Kong, more pointedly, was so seductive. Because, of course, as I suggested, for many Europeans who were at the bottom of the class ladder, back home in London or Manchester, all of a sudden they were at the pinnacle of the pyramid once they landed in Hong Kong, for example, or in British India, for example. Now, I should also once again continue the sub-theme of our discussion today, which is how this is depicted in cinema. There is a very interesting movie called Paradise Road, starring Glenn Close. And I would recommend at least the opening scene. The opening scene shows these Europeans in Singapore engaged in the high life. And of course, they're at a party, and Indian and South Asian servants are serving them sumptuous meals and all the rest. And suddenly there's a boom and an explosion. And the Europeans look around, they continue partying. Then there's another boom. And then all of a sudden, barging into this festive occasion are troops from Imperial Japan. This is a turning point in the history of the racial correlation of forces, February 1942, when Japanese troops seize Singapore, for example. Even NAACP leadership recognized that this was a turning point and that things could never be the same again. And what happens subsequently in the movie is that the Europeans who had been living the high life were reduced to neo-slaves and reduced to servants. In fact, there's one scene in the movie where European women, in order to get hot showers and good meals, agree to be concubines for Japanese military men. And therein you begin to get a glimpse of how gender enters into this fray, and how women of African descent, for example, were treated so atrociously as a direct result. Oh, good. There it is, Paradise Road. It's very interesting. I should also mention, since I mentioned the fact that Hollywood had begun to be invaded, if I can use that verb, by Japanese capital, particularly in the 1980s, that you had an expansion of what I call Japanic movies. A Black Rain with Michael Douglas, Mr. Baseball with Tom Selleck, Rising Sun with Wesley Snipes and Sean Connery, all of which express this anxiety about the rise of Asia, the rise of Japan in that context. And I should point out that that particular Japanese growth is destabilized in the mid-1980s when the European powers gang up on Japan, and the Plaza Accord of 1985, Plaza Hotel, if I'm not mistaken, subsequently owned by one Donald J. Trump in Manhattan, and force a revaluation of the currency, which sends the Japanese economy tumbling into what are called the lost decades. And of course, at the G7 finance ministers meeting in Canada just a few days ago, there's a similar plan hatched to try to gang up on China to force a revaluation of its currency in order to force it into lost decades. But I don't think it's going to work in this case, because China of 2025 is not Japan of 1985. In any case, I think that your question is well taken with regard to class collaboration being an emblem of colonialism, settler colonialism. And sadly enough, many of our friends on the left, who oftentimes invoke what they consider to be the epithet of identity politics to describe Black self-expression, they rarely, if ever, describe Zionism as identity politics, for example, where it's clearly an expression of politics based upon an ethno-religious identity, not to mention centuries of colonialism and settler colonialism. It's really stunning, and it's one of the many reasons why in the United States, at least, we're presently staring down the barrel of fascism, because of an inability or an unwillingness of certain friends on the left to comprehend the landscape on which they purportedly are struggling.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. So before moving forward, I would like to welcome on the stage our comrade, Leonardo Moshe, who's joining us from South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa. Leonardo, I think you also had a question for Dr. Horne, right? Just go ahead.
Yes. Greetings, Professor Horne. So my question is as follows. We want to turn to the Japanese military assault on Hong Kong and the other British held territories in Asia, and how exactly it reversed race relations. So the invasion of Hong Kong was a nightmare for all concerned, but particularly for the Europeans and Euro-Americans, for unlike the Asians, a passing glance revealed them as the probable target of the invaders and their allies. The invasion invoked a massive emotional collapse, a collective nervous breakdown, not least amongst European men. After they seized control, there was a persistent and continuous and very effective racial and cultural propaganda unleashed by the Japanese military. The European and Euro-American expatriates who had expected deference as a virtual birthright were treated less considerably than the higher class Chinese. A flood of anti-white propaganda poured over the people of Hong Kong and spread out from the colony in all directions. The conquered and increasingly unkept community of Europeans and Euro-Americans had received a bitter foretaste of the racial humiliation that was to follow when they were subjected to the debasing march of humiliation through the mean streets of Hong Kong. Their fate was to turn on racial factors which were once passively accepted as brands of privilege, but now were to be treated much more differently. Many were worried that their racial privilege had been destroyed for all time. This assault occurred 4 decades after another stunning Japanese military victory against Tsarist Russia in 1905. Prof, could you talk about why the British and other European colonial powers were so unprepared to face the Japanese Armada?
Well, there are many reasons. I mean, first of all, look at Britain. Here you have this country with a contemporary population of 60 to 65 million. And of course, during the time in question in the 1940s, perhaps 40 to 45 million. And yet they were ruling British India, which includes, among other territories, today's India, today's Pakistan, today's Bangladesh, and not to mention Burma to the east. And this was a very perilous mission, not to mention ruling the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, for example. And then, of course, Hong Kong, Singapore, their comrades in Australia. And I should also mention that with regard to your homeland, South Africa, the precursors of apartheid, which of course is implanted in 1948, they were mightily concerned that Japan, which had established a foothold in neighboring Mozambique, would be stirring up the quote natives, unquote, in South Africa, which was something that was not beyond the realm of imagination. I think that the British were unprepared because they had bitten off more than they could chew. And that's one of the reasons why the baton, in a sense, had to be passed post-1945 to the United States of America. The United States of America has a contemporary population, say, of 330 million, for example, which in this case helps to underscore the point oftentimes mentioned by social scientists that at a certain point that the quantity has a quality all of its own. That is to say, it's difficult to administer a worldwide empire with such a paltry population that Britain endured in the 1940s. And with those words that you just rendered, talking about the propaganda unleashed by Japan after they took over Hong Kong, and in fact, took over a good deal of the British Empire, you need to realize that you should see this once again through the lens of the anti-Black propaganda unleashed when the British began to invade Africa, for example. In other words, just like the Japanese were trying to show that the British and the Europeans and the Euro-Americans were unworthy, making them endure the so-called March of Humiliation, where they're marched through the streets unkempt, with the Asians who had been treated so terribly on the sidewalks and the sidelines, tossing out imprecations and insults and epithets to these once exalted leaders of Hong Kong. A similar sort of propaganda was unleashed against Black people once the British began to invade Africa, once they began to enslave Africans and drive them across the Atlantic. And therein, with regard to World War II, you begin to see why there had to be an agonizing retreat away from the more egregious aspects of white supremacy post-1945, because that old system, which apartheid tried to reinforce in 1948, was clearly a source of instability. There had to be a new way of rule, a new way of administering. And therefore, you begin to see the decline of colonialism, the rise of neo-colonialism, the age and stage in which we still find ourselves enmeshed, where you find Black puppet rulers who can act in the interests of the North Atlantic powers, for example, which is the essence, in a sense, of this age of neocolonialism. But once again, we have to see the age of neocolonialism as not being some sort of reform. We should see it as being an unavoidable adaptation to the punishing defeat administered on the colonialists from 1940 to 1945, and they had to devise new ways of misrule, new ways of rule, hence neocolonialism.
Thank you for that, Prof. Very interesting points. Professor, we would like to move on to the next question. So the Japanese attack on the British Empire also happened in a context where in the United States, there was a pervasive pro-Tokyo sentiment among African Americans. In the first page of the book, Facing the Rising Sun, African Americans, Japan, and the Roots of Afro-Asian Solidarity, recalling how Malcolm X escaped the draft by claiming that he wanted to join the Japanese army and go down south to kill up crackers. As you write, Malcolm Little was hardly singular in his reluctance to join the war-torn military. Mm. By late 1943, African Americans accounted for a whopping 35% of the nation's delinquent registrants. And between 1941 and 1946, thousands of black men were imprisoned for not complying with the Selective Service Act. It may have been asking too much to expect the persecuted U.S. Negroes to unquestioningly throw in their lot with the nation that had pulverized them. In short, pro-Tokyo sentiment was perceived as widespread among U.S. Negroes. This perception was propelled by guilty fear that this oppressed group would seize the moment of war for retribution and retaliation. Why was the pro-Tokyo sentiment so profound among African Americans, and how different was it from the relationship of African Americans to, for example, Mexico, India, which we have discussed in previous episodes?
It's a very good question. And of course, there is a congruence. And in fact, in the book so kindly mentioned in the introduction, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, I point out that during the War of 1812, when the United States tries to seize Canada, and in turn, the Redcoats, the British, invade Washington, D.C., and are joined by U.S. Negroes and helping to torch the White House, sending President James Madison and his girlless spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse. And then the U.S. Negroes escape on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. What I'm trying to suggest is that there was a basic contradiction in the U.S. policy towards Black people. On the one hand, they were being pulverized and persecuted. But on the other hand, the U.S. rulers had all manner of antagonists, not only the British, but various Native American groupings, for example, who the Black people allied with in Florida. I'm speaking of the Seminoles. I'm out here in Victoria, British Columbia, as we speak, and working on a book about how this piece of real estate was at issue between Britain and the United States in the 1840s and the 1850s. And one of the reasons why the state of Oregon, now part of the United States of America, banned slavery, but also banned U.S. Negroes. Our liberal friends, they focus on the former point. They banned slavery, but actually they banned all U.S. Negroes. And the reason they did it, because they thought that the U.S. Negroes would ally with the Native Americans, thereby jeopardizing European settler colonialism. So the long and the short of it is that what basically was exhibited in the 1940s had a long pedigree. There was a long history of Black people aligning with the real and imagined foes of the U.S. ruling class. And once again, just how I pointed out in the previous comment, how this caused a shift from colonialism to neo-colonialism in the colonized world, because obviously the old system of colonialism was not working very well. Likewise, in the United States of America, it was inevitable post-1945 that there would be a shift from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, which it was thought was riling up the Black Americans unnecessarily, making them susceptible to being wooed by real and imagined adversaries of the U.S. ruling class. You began to see an agonizing retreat away from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, as represented by the passage of laws in the 1950s and the 1960s, Supreme Court decisions, etc. But alas, what's happened with the passage of time is that the ruling class, on the one hand, feels it has little to fear from Black Americans allying in 2025 with the real and imagined adversaries of the U.S. ruling class. And at the same time, over the past 7 decades or so, there has been a retreat of Black internationalism, whereby many of our Black intellectuals and leaders are not aware of the history we're discussing this morning, or not aware of the fact that perhaps the better part of wisdom today would be to broker global alliances. One of the contradictions of the United States right now is that in Black America, on the one hand, you have very sour opinions of those with whom we share this continent. I'm speaking of the settlers, for example, to the point where there is a popular religion that suggests that the Black America, that these Euro-Americans are actually devils. All right, fair enough. But at the same time, if that's your point of view, you would think you would try to have international alliances against these devils. But somehow that has not taken place to the point where I'm very concerned in 2025 that Black Americans could easily be swept up into this anti-China, anti-Asian hysteria, anti-Russian hysteria, because of a failure to understand the importance of internationalism in our struggle, which is once again pointing up the importance of this discussion this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. I wanted to go back to something that you've mentioned briefly during the discussion, which was the reaction of the colonized peoples in Asia to the Japanese attack against the British Empire, right? So in the book, you talk about, for example, the experiences of two people who'd become prominent politicians in independent Singapore and Malaysia. So we talk about the reactions of the Lee Kuan Yew, who would eventually become the Prime Minister of Singapore, and also Mahathir Mohamad, right? So about those two characters, you write, and I quote, "Though present-day Malaysia," so we're talking about 20 years ago, when they were still in office, though present-day Malaysia, with a Malay majority, and Singapore with a Chinese majority, often disagree on many things, it is striking that the prominent figure in Malaysian history, Mahathir Mohamad, agrees with Lee Kuan Yew on the importance of the Japanese interregnum. "It completely changed our world," he said. "Not only did the Japanese forces physically oust the British, they also changed our view of the world." He studied Japanese and remains friendly with Tokyo. "For those who went to Japanese schools and were willing to learn the language, the Japanese occupation was not too painful. Of course," he adds, "people of Chinese origin suffered more and many were killed or held in captivity. But as for himself, he was not violently opposed to the Japanese. He even accepted some key arguments of the Japanese right. Even today, some Japanese will argue that their occupation of Asia was not so much an act of aggression towards the Asian nation as it was an attempt to free us from European colonial rule. There is at least some truth to that argument. The success of the Japanese invasion convinced us that there is nothing inherently superior in the Europeans. They could be defeated. They could be reduced to groveling before an Asian race, the Japanese." So my question is, so how did the Japanese attack on the British Empire embolden non-whites in Asia and around the world? And when you say around the world, we also mean Africans on the continent, in the diaspora. So how did that attack embolden them to confront European colonialism?
Well, first of all, I have to introduce the concept of relativity, which is a concept that perhaps intentionally is not well understood. I mean, for example, I was just talking about my work out here today as we speak on colonialism in what is now British Columbia, the U.S. state of Washington, the U.S. state of Oregon. And I think it's fair to say that the settlers in the United States were much more horrendous in their treatment of the indigenous populations, up to and including genocide. Whereas when you say that, the perhaps insincere critics begin to think that you're giving a pass to British colonialism. No, I'm not giving it. It's a concept of relativity. There is a difference between extractive colonialism, which was exemplified by the Hudson Bay Company here in Canada, whereby they were trying to extract resources, as opposed to settler colonialism, where they now were trying to extract resources. They were trying to wipe out the entire indigenous population. to the point where in the Washington Territory, before the state of Washington comes into the Union, they ruled illegal all marriages between European settlers and indigenous. Why, you ask? Because they thought that indigenous women would be spies against the European settlers, and so therefore they could not be marriage partners. Now, that's the context for which we should try to understand Japanese colonialism and imperialism. The Japanese right makes the point that is difficult to argue with, that if you compare present-day South Korea, which of course was a Japanese colony, or present-day Taiwan, the rebel province off the coast of China, which was a Japanese colony, that these are powerful economic engines in 2025. And they would say that that has something to do with the rough rule, to use a euphemism, of Japanese imperialism. Now, compare the Philippines, for example, where the United States took over in the 1890s at the same time that Japan was taking over Taiwan, for example. And of course, Japan takes over South Korea in 1910. I mean, the Philippines, by way of comparison, is still a kind of slum of Washington. Now, one has to be very careful in making these points, because once again, the insincere critics will accuse you, or accuse me, of giving a pass to Japanese depredations, which is why I'm glad you began our discussion with those opening sentences that I introduced, that I think that trying to understand difficult realities is not easy. And certainly I find it remarkable that in British India, Subhash Chandra Bose, who I talk about in the book, who was an Indian national hero on the level of Nehru and Gandhi, he died shoulder to shoulder fighting with Japanese forces against the British, for example. Not unlike the US Negroes in Washington, D.C. allying with the British when they invaded Washington, D.C. I mean, it's too much to ask people who are oppressed and persecuted to be choosy and picky with regard to who they ally with in order to fight their ultimate foe. And likewise, with regard to Indonesia, the powerhouse of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the largest predominantly Islamic country on planet Earth, many of the Indonesian nationalists were like Mahathir, who is still in the land of the living. I think he's about 98 or 99 years old right now, in terms of being pro-Tokyo. Now, what's ironic in the United States and all of these other places is that many of the communist forces with which I am sympathetic, they oppose these sorts of alliances with Japan. And they allied with the British against the Japanese, for example. And of course, Paul Robeson issued polemics in the 1940s against pro-Tokyo Negroes who were espousing the line of the Asiatic black man. But alas, after the war ended, then they became persecuted, for example, by the US authorities. Paul Robeson's income fell from the 6 figures to the low 4 figures, for example. His passport was taken. They attempted to drive him to suicide, for example. So all I'm saying is that these struggles are very difficult, that we're enmeshed in historically and today. And certainly, I think that it's oftentimes useful to revisit these struggles to see if there was another path possible, to see if there was another way to accomplish our goals.
Thank you for that, Prof. Professor Horne, we're going to move on to our next point of discussion. As far as African Americans were concerned, their reaction to the persecution of Japanese Americans in the USA was ambivalent. to say the least. On the one hand, there was sympathy and solidarity with a group of non-whites that was subjected to state-led persecutions, as you write in the book. Another reason why US Negroes were inflamed to the point of attempting sedition was the mass internment of Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals generally, with, as they saw it, little outcry from Euro Americans. This could be their fate too, thought many Negroes. And the sour reaction to this epochal event did little to build national unity or convince many Negroes that attaining first-class citizenship might be possible. The pre-existing rhetorical barrage about the presumed commonalities of the colored races predisposed US Negroes to sense they were next on the chopping block, and perhaps they should preempt this potential fiasco by aligning with Tokyo. This was the context for the trial in East St. Louis. On the other hand, other African Americans saw the internment of Japanese Americans as an opportunity to seize their properties, as you write in Facing the Rising Sun. Nevertheless, US Negroes' stance of solidarity with Japanese Americans was not as straightforward as it appeared. All along the Pacific coast, as Japanese Americans were removed, US Negroes from the Texas-Louisiana corridor particularly migrated to take their time in Los Angeles, for example. Little Tokyo quickly became Bronzeville. A Negro woman took over a cafe, formerly controlled by a now removed Japanese American. Claude A. Burnett huffed that elites might prefer Mexicans since they can ship them back home when they get troublesome. He wanted Negroes to leave the urban lights and go to the truck farms as owners or workers, and expressed little concern for the interned. By April 1942, the Negro press reported that 20 colored students per day had chosen to register to replace Jap farmhands. In 1944, when the NAACP branch in Los Angeles launched a campaign on behalf of the evacuated Japanese Americans, it was not greeted with unanimous approval. Negroes may lose most of Little Tokyo if Jap freed, was a typical press account. Yet restraining these more unfortunate anti-Nisai attitudes was the idea peddled by Los Angeles mayor who advocated restraining the further influx of Negroes, which reminded those who had forgotten that there might be a larger foe to confront. How has this type of opportunism complicated the relationship between African Americans and other non-white groups in the US?
Well, to recapitulate, in the vast region stretching from Seattle in the northwest corner of the United States down to San Diego on the border with Mexico, you had large populations of Japanese ancestry, and they, of course, were interned, that is to say, put in concentration camps. Their property was taken, including the aforementioned truck farms, for example, where they grew fruits and vegetables. There was an attempt to attract U.S. Negroes from Texas and Louisiana to take their place. You should also recognize that the United States put pressure on other authorities, some of whom did not need pressure to do the same thing. I'm speaking of a similar wiping out of the Japanese American community in Canada, a similar attack on the Japanese community of Japanese ancestry in Mexico, for example. If you go further down the Pacific to Peru, some of your audience might remember the former leader of Peru, who only died recently, although his daughter is still a leading politician in Peru, Alberto Fujimori, of Japanese ancestry. Of course, there was pressure on the Peruvians to act similarly with regard to the population of Japanese descent across the continent. In Brazil, you probably know that one of the most sizable Japanese expatriate communities on planet Earth happens to be in Brazil. There was similar pressure on Brazil to act in a similar fashion, pressure from the U.S. authorities. And so to put it in context, when you have Claude Barnett and other spokespersons for the Black community expressing little or no concern about the fate and destiny of expropriated Japanese Americans, you need to realize that he was not alone. And the question oftentimes becomes, to what extent is this raw, naked opportunism? And to what extent is it a capitulation and a surrender to white supremacy exerted by Washington and Wall Street? Whatever the case, obviously, as the implication of your question tends to suggest, it becomes very difficult for Black Americans subsequently to seek political support outside of our own community when you have many of our leaders and spokespersons taking a rather cavalier attitude towards such a horrible example of deprivation of human rights, as exemplified by the Japanese internment. And once again, to bring this point up to the present, you see a similar dilemma today. I mean, for example, Mr. Trump has made it clear that when he deports undocumented so-called illegal immigrants to hellhole prisons in El Salvador, Mr. Trump has made clear that, quote, homegrowns, unquote, that is to say, U.S. nationals, perhaps Black Americans who carry U.S. passports, will be next. When Mr. Trump, as he did just a few days ago, deported undocumented workers of Cuban ancestry, Mexican ancestry to South Sudan, but then they got diverted into Djibouti, where they're still stalled. Given the rapacious nature of this ruling class, it's not beyond the stretch of imagination to think that Black Americans could be deported to unrest and instability in South Sudan and perhaps be then diverted to Djibouti, for example. So I think that one of the lessons of history that we should extract is that even though it may be difficult, and I should underline difficult, it may be difficult to be principled in the midst of swirling controversy. It may be difficult to be principled when you feel that you can gain a cafe that was once owned by a Japanese American, or a truck farm once owned by a Japanese American, and therefore improve the lot of your own family, not to mention yourself. At the end of the day, I think we must stand up on principle, and we must reject opportunism. But alas, that is easier said than done.
Thank you for that very powerful point, Dr. Horne. I think this is very important because even us as people living in diaspora in Europe, we're struggling with that. Because, for example, you have a lot of people who are born and raised in France. They don't want to identify or show any form of solidarity with undocumented migrants from Africa, for example, or even from people who were born in Africa and came here later. They don't want to, and who have like proper documents, they don't want to identify or even show any form of solidarity with undocumented migrants, because, as you said, some people feel that as long as their situation is comfortable, they don't have to worry about others. So this is a very powerful point, well taken. I think we need to make reels out of this and share it massively, right? I know we are running out of time, but I did have a final question, which to me is very important. I wanted to make sure that I ask it before we close, which is in the concluding pages of Race War, right? So again, this book, Japanese Attack on British Empire. You write about the lessons of the Pacific War, and I'm going to quote you here, final quote from your book. You write that the Pacific War precipitated a massive crisis for white supremacy. The mighty empire was reduced to asserting that it has become abundantly clear that the Africans are exploding the myth established by the Japs during the original conquest of Burma, that they are unsurpassed as jungle fighters, right? The powerful proponents of white supremacy had sunk to the point where they were extolling the might of alleged inferior Africans to undermine the idea of superiority of Japanese fighters. The message to the Africans was clear. If they were so mighty, why were they languishing under colonial rule, supervised by Europeans, apparently unable to fight their own battles? If British troops were taking flight in the jungles of Burma, pursued by smaller Japanese, why should they react any differently if confronted by Africans? So, as you've pointed out in many of the interviews that you've given recently, and also some of the books that you've written, I'm thinking of the Counter-Revolution of 1836, the roots of US fascism. So as you've pointed out on numerous occasions, we are living in a period in which white supremacist, colonial, and racist forces are galvanized in Europe, in North America, and also in the Middle East, as we can see, and the current genocidal assault against the Palestinians. So in such a context, where do you think our salvation from white supremacy will come from? I know it's a difficult question.
Difficult indeed. I should also say, to embroider the previous point, that what needs to be realized is that these empires, the British Empire, for example, the French Empire, they were heavily dependent upon Black troops to fight their battles for them. At the pivotal Battle of Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, 1954, the French were heavily dependent upon Senegalese troops, for example.
My grandfather did fight that war, by the way, just a footnote. He was in Indochina. I say my grandfather was sent to Indochina by the French. So he was among the Senegalese who fought that war.
Oh, wow, far out. Well, and it's the same for the British, for example. What made the British Empire so mighty is that they were heavily dependent upon these expert fighters from British India, what are now Pakistanis, the Sikhs, for example, who have centuries-long experience with battling, for example. So I should make that point to begin with. That's one of the many reasons why there was such reluctance to move away from the old system of colonialism to independence, because then the British and the French would not have these ebony soldiers to rely upon. And it also underscores what I mentioned earlier, the fact that when the baton was passed to the United States of America, which has a population of 330 million, which in many ways is a precursor of the European Union, insofar as you have many of these folk of European extraction who migrate across the Atlantic and are redefined as white: Lithuanians, Hungarians, Russians, Germans, Bulgarians, Serbs, Croats, English, Irish, Welsh, etc. And that gives the United States more heft in order to carry on the struggle for neocolonialism, just as Britain and France were the avatars of colonialism, for example. Now, with regard to your very difficult question, I think that it depends on the population that you're referring to. I would say that with regard to our friends on the continent of Africa, the steps that they are taking are worthy of support. I'm thinking of the summit that's to take place in September 2025 between the African Union leaders and the leaders of CARICOM, the Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, with reparations being high on the agenda. Once again, one way to view reparations is as wealth redistribution, for example. That is to say, the misbegotten gains extracted by the North Atlantic powers from the Caribbean and Africa being redirected to the Caribbean and Africa. And once again, as I tell my friends in North America, if you're really serious about reparations, you're going to have to resolve this contradiction that you're now wallowing in, where on the one hand, you are sympathetic to the idea that these people of European descent actually might be devils. But on the other hand, in order to combat these, quote, devils, unquote, you turn your back on the Russians and the Chinese, who are the antagonists of those who we're fighting in Washington and Wall Street. You really have to resolve that contradiction somehow. And I think that goes to an answer to your intriguing question, which is what way forward? I think the way forward in the first instance for people of African descent is internationalism. As once again, I tell our friends in the United States of America, you have the mighty U.S. empire. They feel that they cannot take on China mano a mano, or one-on-one, that they have to recruit the Indians, the Australians, the Japanese, the South Koreans. I mean, they're internationalists as well. And so that somehow we don't have as much power as those who were fighting, but we're supposed to dispense with internationalism. Obviously, that makes no sense, and it's a sure route to defeat. And so as a result, I remain confident because I know that our comrades and friends here in North America, they are not interested in pursuing a sure route to defeat. They are more interested in pursuing a sure route to victory.
Once again, Dr. Horne, would like to thank you. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. Please make sure you like, share, subscribe. So this was the 5th episode of Amandla, a monthly program with historian political activist Dr. Gerald Horne on Black Power Media Reloaded. So Dr. Horne, is there any remark, comment that you would like to make before we close? Maybe you want to talk about the book that you're working on or the one that was just published.
Well, I mean, first of all, I would redirect our audience to our opening, where I pointed out the intractability and the difficulty of some of these issues that we're discussing, and how I'm not a fan of Japanese imperialism or colonialism, but I am a fan of trying to analyze events objectively and trying to analyze how our antagonists oftentimes ran aground because of their involvement in Asian affairs and what lessons we can extract as a result. With regard to the second point that you raised, I would direct our audience to this book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C. to 1800 to 1865, because once again, despite the fact that some of our friends on the left continue to insist that the creation of the United States was this great leap forward for humanity, our ancestors did not agree with that. And one of the reasons they did not agree is that at the same time, on Capitol Hill in Washington, you had these congresspersons prattling and prating about freedom and liberty. A few steps from where they were speaking, you had Africans being sold. Across the river in Alexandria, Virginia, you had one of the most significant slave trading enterprises this side of Cairo, Egypt, or Istanbul, for example. At the same time, this was supposed to be a great leap forward for humanity. Obviously, what they should say is that in some ways they're saluting a precursor of apartheid, because it's like going to South Africa post 1948 and seeing all the programs meant to uplift the European minority and seeing that as a precedent for uplifting the African majority. If you were to make that statement, you would be condemned, I imagine, as some sort of lunatic. But fundamentally, that's what our friends on the left are suggesting. That is to say, all these programs, which were designed to uplift the Europeans, seizing the land of the Native Americans, liquidating the Native Americans, enslaving the Africans. There were thousands of Africans enslaved in the late 18th century, millions by 1861 on the verge of the U.S. Civil War, which eventuates in the abolition of slavery. I mean, once again, I'm sad to say that there's little wonder why we're staring down the barrel of fascism in the United States of America, because if you don't understand the landscape, the terrain on which you're struggling, inevitably you're going to be making boneheaded mistakes and making ill-advised prognostications. And that's where we stand for many, I'm afraid to say, in the United States of America.
Thank you for the advice, Dr. Horne. I hope our friends on the left and others will take note and will also apply those lessons. Thank you also, Leonardo, who was my co-host for today. Also like thank Kalanji, that people cannot see on the screen, but who was backstage to make this program possible. Thank you to our viewers, and looking forward to next episode of Amandla will probably be at the end of this month or next month. So for those who would like to keep discussing some of the work of Dr. Gerald Horne, please make sure that you like, share, subscribe, and show up for the next episode of Amandla. Thank you.
We do not see the creation of the United States in the 18th century as a great leap forward for humanity. We see the creation of the United States of America as a great leap forward for enslavement of Africans, as a great leap forward in terms of European settlers seizing the land of the indigenous and then liquidating them. I'm afraid to say that many of our so-called friends on the left have either ignored our intervention, which is like biology teachers deciding that they don't like the uncovering of DNA in the early 1950s, and so therefore they're not going to teach that in their biology classes. And so this is scandalous. These books that I've been writing about slavery also invoke the notion of revolution. That is to say, my book confronting Black Jacobins, the United States Haitian Revolution, the origins of the Dominican Republic, confronts the epical, profound Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a successful revolt of the enslaved. Many of us in the Black liberation movement in the United States pay careful and close attention to the international situation. And we use that in order to plot strategy. That helps to determine whether or not we should advance or should we retreat. And right now, I would say it's time for advance. I often say about the United States, if you want to keep it secret, publish it in a book, because people don't read. But I'm also beginning to think they don't necessarily listen either. So obviously there's something deeper. There's some sort of ideological blind spot that hampers the absorption of reality.